Hello everybody and welcome back. I'm really excited to do today's video because it's about a really fun topic. One of my favorites in Elvis history. This would be Elvis's romance with Ann-Margret. This is a much storied chapter of Elvis's life and a very popular one. This is something that really captures a lot of people's imagination. It's got a lot of mystique around it because for all the details that we do know about it, there's a lot that we don't know, and I think that's very intriguing for a lot of people. Ann-Margret is a legend and an icon in her own right. And in a way, we kind of have the receipts for this relationship from what we can see of the on-screen chemistry in Viva Las Vegas, which I think really leads us to think that if the chemistry between these two was this explosive on-screen, we can only imagine what it was like off-screen. Additionally, we'll often come across a very popular theory that Ann-Margret and Elvis were actually star-crossed soulmates. And so there's a lot of questions, I think, when it comes to this, with them what might have been. I think for a lot of people, there's a thought that maybe if somehow this relationship had worked out and they had been able to stay together, this might have somehow changed things for Elvis. You know, if you're reading about this at all, it's not uncommon, for example, to come across theories that perhaps maybe if Elvis and Ann had found a way to stay together, this might have changed things for Elvis. I've seen it speculated many times that perhaps a relationship with Ann could have saved him. Of course, at the end of the day, the answers to these questions are always going to be unknowable, wish fulfillment fantasy. So let's dig in a little bit. As we know, Elvis and Ann-Margret first met early in production on the set of Viva Las Vegas. There is a rumor that perhaps Elvis had made a little bit of a play for Ann-Margret a few years before this by sending a member of his entourage to invite her to spend time with him. Supposedly Ann turned this down under the guise of only being interested in men who would approach her themselves. So initially there were some crossed wires here. This wasn't a connection that landed, but it did a few years later when they were both cast in Viva Las Vegas. And to really kind of understand the hype that this caused and what a big deal it was to have Ann-Margret in an Elvis movie, I think that it's important to get to know Ann-Margret a little bit first and where she was at this moment in her career. Ann-Margret was born in Sweden in 1941. She was an only child who had a very close relationship with both of her parents. Ann would really see this as a commonality between she and Elvis, the fact that they had both grown up only children, the fact that they were both very attached to their parents. Ann immigrated to the United States when she was 5 years old. Her father had come over first before she and her mother joined him. And Ann described herself as really growing up feeling like an outsider, which led to her feeling even more attached to her family. This is really where her strongest emotional connections and her sense of security came from. Her family was very poor and financially struggled throughout her childhood, which really kind of reinforced that feeling of being an outsider. Much like Elvis, Ann described her upbringing as being very simple, very traditional, very religious, and she really felt that this was something that she and Elvis could connect on, having had similar backgrounds. One area where Ann did find a sense of belonging as a young girl was in her interest for dance. As a young child, she showed a real talent for dancing. She began to take dance lessons, and although she did briefly attend 1 year of Northwestern University after high school, she ended up leaving this, opting to pursue a dancing career instead. She joined a dance troupe, which took her to Las Vegas. And while she was performing with this dance troupe in Las Vegas, she was discovered by George Burns. George Burns went on to become a little bit of a mentor for Ann. He was so dazzled by her singing and dancing talents, as well as just her overall stage presence. Much like Elvis, Ann was a real dynamo on stage. She had a very strong presence. It was very compelling to the audience. And so she immediately stood out to George Burns. He decided to cast her in his annual holiday show. And things blew up very quickly for Ann from this point forward. She immediately really got a lot of attention. People were very interested in her. It didn't take long at all before offers started pouring in. In fact, by 1961, Ann had both a recording contract with RCA and had a slew of film deals coming in. Ann immediately connected with a manager and an agent who kind of took charge of shaping her career at this point. And they were taking an approach of really trying to build up hype and excitement about Ann. It worked. She very much was the it girl of the moment. And I think when we think of Ann-Margret during this time period, she's really emblematic of a certain moment in the 60s. She was very hip, very of the moment. And in a lot of ways, she really encapsulated sort of the total package fantasy at that time. Ann was also multi-talented. She could sing, she could dance. There was a lot of hope that she would also be able to translate this into an acting career. Right away, she was also really being marketed as the female Elvis. This had to do with a couple of different factors. One was her very sensual style of dancing. The other was her singing style. And I think it was also just sort of an overall dynamic presence. Much like Elvis, she had a very electric energy that really, really captured people's attention. And so immediately there was a great deal of hype around her. Interestingly, when Ann recorded her first album for RCA, the plan was really to kind of play up on this Elvis connection. A lot of care was put into selecting material that was sort of reminiscent of Elvis's style. She even did a cover of Heartbreak Hotel on her first album, but there was definitely a concerted effort to draw the parallel there. People were always hoping to recapture lightning in a bottle with the Elvis phenomenon, and I think that the idea of doing this with a female performer was very novel at the time. Ann blew up very quickly, became the name on everybody's lips. There was a lot of interest in Hollywood in trying to exploit this attention that she was drawing. I think it was immediately obvious to people that she really did have something special that could translate well on screen, and so the interest in getting her in movies right away was very strong. Ann's first few films didn't necessarily do well commercially, but they were helpful in bringing her notice. She got good reviews. Although she had smaller supporting roles in these films, it was enough to draw attention to her and get her good notices. She was considered to be well on her way to a major film career. Ann's first real big break in films came in Bye Bye Birdie. You know, as we all know, Bye Bye Birdie was a little bit of a satirical look at a fictional Elvis-like character, and it was meant to sort of gently parody America's reaction to Elvis being drafted into the Army. It had been a very popular Broadway show. There was a lot of excitement about bringing it to the big screen. And it was really the perfect vehicle for Ann to first show her talents. She was part of a large ensemble cast here, so the pressure really wasn't on her to carry the picture single-handedly, but it was a great opportunity for her to really shine and end up stealing the picture, which is exactly what she did. Also, I think that the role that Ann-Margret played in Bye Bye Birdie was a really good opportunity to highlight what she described as the dual nature of her personality. The way that Ann describes herself in her 1990s autobiography, Ann-Margret, My Story, is that she really had two very distinct personas, one off camera and one on camera. Ann describes herself off camera at this time as being very shy, somewhat reserved, a little bit insecure and timid. Definitely not the words that we think of when we get an image of Ann-Margret in our head. In fact, we really think of her as being more the polar opposite. And this was the side of her personality that she identifies as coming out when she was on stage or on camera. She found it very easy to kind of shift gears and tap into this part of herself that was very bombastic, very confident, very sexual, very energetic. And it's really that kind of high voltage energy that we associate with her, especially during her film roles during this time in her career. And she got the chance to display a little bit of both of these in Bye Bye Birdie. Her character was essentially the girl next door, but she did have a chance in the musical's bombastic song and dance numbers to really show some of her flair, some of her sex appeal, and it proved to be a really delicious combination. Ann's part was originally supposed to be pretty small in this film. However, the director, George Sidney, who would also go on to direct her in Viva Las Vegas, was so blown away by her that he ended up really expanding her role. And it's really obvious when you watch her shots in this movie that the camera was definitely favoring her. I think George Sidney was very, very aware of what a dazzling screen presence Ann-Margret was and really wanted to exploit it as much as he could for the benefit of this movie. In fact, she ended up sort of edging out Janet Leigh in the lead female role. Janet Leigh was originally cast to be the female lead, But because Ann's character was expanded and favored very much in the way the film was shot, she really ended up stealing the movie. In a lot of ways, Bye Bye Birdie was really kind of the perfect vehicle for Ann. She got to sing, she got to dance, she got to really show her stuff in this. Although a bit dated by today's standards, it's a really fun musical. It's just kind of bright and colorful and frothy, and I think it was a really good fit for Ann at that time. So moving on from that, Viva Las Vegas was really kind of a natural progression, and whoever had the stroke of genius to pair Elvis and Ann-Margret on screen really struck gold with this idea, because like Bye Bye Birdie, Viva Las Vegas was also a very energetic, bright, fun, flashy musical, so it was a great opportunity for her to show off her talents in singing and dancing, and also a great opportunity to really pair her with somebody who could match her. And Ann-Margret in Viva Las Vegas was a little bit of a rarity in Elvis's film career. Usually, although all of his movies feature a strong love story at the center, the female leads usually weren't cast in such a way to be people who would detract attention from Elvis or potentially steal the show from him. So Ann was a little bit of a rarity in this regard. The pairing of these two immediately generated a lot of excitement and interest before production had even begun. And it wasn't long before the rumor mill was already speculating about the idea of an off-screen romance between these two. Now, it was pretty well established by that time in the fan magazines and Hollywood press that Elvis did have a penchant of having romances with his co-stars, so this was kind of well-known information. Another person who was already beginning to speculate on the prospect of a romance between these two, but not in such an excited way, was Priscilla. At the time that Elvis was getting ready to start filming Viva Las Vegas, Priscilla had just graduated high school. Although Ann-Margret at 22 was really only a few years older than Priscilla at this time, they probably couldn't have been any more different. Ann's image at this time was independent, feisty, ambitious. She was also pretty much every male in America's sexual fantasy. She was considered to be the total package. She was talented, she was often photographed riding motorcycles in fan magazines, so she kind of had this feisty, daredevil, rough and tumble side, but also was being very marketed as a sex kitten. She was a pretty formidable romantic opponent, and this wasn't lost on Priscilla. Priscilla was immediately nervous about this pairing and begged to go on location with Elvis for the filming so that she could keep an eye on things. Elvis's excuse to her for why she couldn't do this was that because this was an unusual experience for him to be cast against such a strong female lead, and Ann-Margret was generating so much excitement in the industry, he really felt that he had to be on his toes for this. He didn't want her to walk away with the movie. And so the excuse he gave Priscilla for why she couldn't come was that he was going to need to really focus on this, put all of his energy into it. He just wouldn't have time for any distractions. It doesn't sound like Priscilla particularly bought that, but it was enough to keep her tucked away at home. Not happily, though. As we often hear, Priscilla spent a lot of time during the filming of the movie reading about the romance in fan magazines, questioning Elvis about what was going on, dyeing her hair blonde to compete a little bit with Ann-Margret's look. So I think it's pretty fair to say that this was fairly preoccupying for her. It's very easy to understand why. The likes of Ann-Margret would have been very intimidating for any of us, I think. From what we hear about how this relationship really began to develop between them on the set, most of the accounts of the people who were present really say that the sparks flew immediately. They could tell very early into the filming that there was something really special with the chemistry between these two stars. And this is very apparent when we watch the movie today. In a lot of ways, Viva Las Vegas really follows the standard Elvis formula for movies. It was very rare for Elvis to be on camera with somebody who really was his match on screen. Doing an Elvis movie really was an excellent choice for Ann's career at this point. It was a chance to be in a big, splashy musical production where she could really show off her singing and dancing talents. In order to fully utilize Ann's talents, she was also given the rare distinction for an Elvis leading lady of being given her own solo numbers, as well as several duets with Elvis. We really don't see this happening again after Ann-Margret, unless your last name was Sinatra. And it was very obvious during production as they were filming these numbers that Ann was really kind of eating the camera up. One person who took note of this was the Colonel, who began to get a little bit antsy and anxious about the idea that Ann might steal some of this movie away from Elvis. As a result, Ann's musical numbers were trimmed down considerably, and some conversations were had with the director, George Sidney, about making sure that the camera wasn't exclusively favoring Ann. Much as he had with the filming of Bye Bye Birdie, George Sidney was just absolutely infatuated with Ann-Margret, and this really shows in the filming of the movie. Even as their romance developed, there was still a little bit of a professional competitiveness between Elvis and Ann-Margret, and regardless of what was happening with them off camera, Elvis did have some frustrations over the fact that he felt the director was so clearly favoring Ann with the camera work and angles. When you see Ann in this movie, it's really easy to understand why. She does have a really magnetic presence. This is really one of the few Elvis movies where I think the chemistry between the leads is as visceral as it is. I also feel watching this that you can really feel the energy and intensity that Elvis was putting into this performance too. When you see them on screen together, he just seems very there. Ann describes this, in fact, and says that when they were performing dance scenes together, they just kind of fell into a natural rhythm with each other. They could kind of intuit what the other was going to do, and this led to just a really natural rhythm between the two of them. Elvis started out by inviting Ann to hang out platonically with he and his entourage, and she was a pretty natural fit for the group. It's funny, like when you watch interviews of the Memphis Mafia recollecting their time with Ann, particularly in the All the King's Men documentary, you can really see how smitten with Ann-Margret these guys were. You sort of, when they're talking about her, it's almost like you see like little hearts in their eyes, floating in the air. And it's just really obvious how much they adored her. She's described by them as having been a real sweetheart, very down to earth, somebody who just kind of naturally could fall into the group and become one of the guys. Ann was very accepting of their presence. She didn't seem to resent the fact that they were around. She seemed to just kind of have a natural understanding of the role they played for Elvis, why it was important for him that they be there, and never seemed to have any issues with them being around. Ann herself, when she's describing herself at this point in her life, acknowledges that despite the image that she had then of this kind of girl about town who was known for dating a lot of handsome celebrities, that wasn't quite the reality of where she was at that point in her life. She describes herself as still remaining very emotionally dependent on her parents at this time, which led to a situation where it was difficult for a relationship to get but so far with her. She really saw her parents as the center of her life at this point, and it was hard for her to get truly intimate. She wasn't quite ready to give up the security of her parents being her primary relationships. So although she was in her early 20s at this point, she says that at that point in her life, she was actually used to bringing her parents on dates for a little extra security, and so it really wasn't anything unusual to have the guys around. She really kind of identified with the idea that Elvis's entourage provided a feeling of security for him, and she was very respectful of that idea. It didn't take long, however, before Elvis was ready to start spending time alone with Ann-Margret and started sending the message to his friends that it was time to scram. In fact, word was also sent to some of the young ladies who often came to his parties to make themselves scarce as he was getting closer with Ann-Margret. And what really kind of stands out when we listen to the accounts of Elvis's intimates and people who were present during this time was the idea that they noticed Elvis sort of stepping out of his comfort zone a little bit with Ann-Margret and allowing himself to be in positions where he wasn't always necessarily in the driver's seat, which was unusual for what they generally observed about his patterns and relationships. He began to really want to spend copious amounts of time alone with Ann-Margret to a degree that was different from what they had seen before. He also sort of broke his own rule of only having girls come to him by traveling alone to Ann-Margret's house in Hollywood Hills to spend time with her. He and Ann would sort of bunker down in his hotel suite for entire weekends and not allow anybody else in. The guys would even really kind of do things to try to break their concentration on each other by playing little shenanigans like trying to listen through the wall or sticking things under the door, sticking lit papers under the door to try to smoke them out of the suite, even shining butter knives and sticking them under the door so they could kind of try to look at them like mirrors and see what was going on. But none of this was able to draw them out. Ann and Elvis were very committed during this time to enjoying their sacred alone time together. Ann says that during this time, this was when Elvis really began to kind of let his walls down for her. She felt very flattered by the idea that he trusted her enough to reveal things about himself to her, his dreams, his hopes, his fears, his vulnerabilities. And during this time, according to Ann, they formed an intense emotional bond. Now, Ann, to her credit, unlike some others, Ann has always been fairly discreet and sparing in what she's shared. She did write about it in her memoir, but it's a relatively small part of her memoir, and she's very discreet in what she shares. Ann has always really made it clear that her time with Elvis was very private, very sacred to her, and that out of respect for him, she chooses not to share many details of it, but she does let us know that their feelings for each other were very strong. I think that the way that Ann has sort of pieced this story for us really creates a sort of less is more dynamic where we're able to project a lot on it. That almost makes it seem all the more powerful. I think it is to Ann's credit that she has remained as discreet about this as she has. Discretion is somewhat of a rarity in the Elvis world when it comes to people sharing their memories. One of the interesting observations from Sonny West's memoir, he felt like Ann-Margret really brought out a different side of Elvis. And this continued even long after their romance, when their relationship had turned platonic. He noted that whenever Ann was around, Elvis just seemed more relaxed. He was less demanding on the people around him. He seemed to be happier. Ann just kind of brought out this calmer side in him. Sonny also noted that Elvis was a little bit more accepting of things when Ann-Margret was around that he wouldn't have been with other women he was involved with. For example, what Sonny says is that most of the guys knew not to flirt with the women that were around Elvis in front of him or even pay too much attention to them. That was something that he would be bothered by. But he didn't seem to have this hang up with Ann. Because everybody was so infatuated and bowled over by Ann-Margret, the guys just, I think, had a little bit of a harder time not flirting with her. And Sonny describes Elvis as being pretty jovial about this, laughing, going along with it, not really having a problem with it. And that was not a behavior that they were used to seeing from him. So there was just something different about the energy between he and Ann-Margret. When Ann describes their relationship, she describes him as her soulmate. And she finds a lot of commonalities, and she points out what she sees as being a lot of commonalities between them that led to this really intense connection. Some of the things that she points out are the similarities in their upbringing and their relationships with their families, but also the ways that early fame, they were both around the same age when their careers blew up. And so she was acutely aware of what she saw as being the impact that that kind of early fame had on their development. She describes both she and Elvis at this time as being somewhat emotionally stunted from the experience of early fame and very emotionally dependent. She also describes them as both having self-sabotaging and self-destructive streaks, having big egos, both being fairly ambitious. So she sees these commonalities between them as things that allowed them to connect in a really unique way. She also points out that they both had those dual natures where on screen and on stage, they had one persona that they went into that was very extroverted, but that off camera, they both were fairly shy. They both were shy. They battled with their own insecurities. They were both deeply religious. They both really valued their families. Anne really saw them as sort of being opposite sides of the same coin. She just felt that there were so many similarities. They did talk in the abstract about marriage and being together. However, Anne is very clear that Elvis always told her from the beginning that he had other obligations. Of course, what we all know is that what she's referring to there is the commitment that he had already made to Priscilla, although she doesn't spell it out directly. And she does say that although she always understood and accepted this and never expected a long-term future with Elvis, it was still a very emotionally confusing situation for her. Now, in terms of the duration of this relationship, it's pretty well established by everybody's account, including Anne's, that all in all, the relationship lasted for about a year. Now, as far as exactly what led to it breaking down, my guess here is that whatever it was that was happening between them was serious enough that it just sort of came to a point where they were either going to make a commitment and be together or not. Of anybody that he was involved with during the duration of his relationship with Priscilla, this seems to have been the only one that really posed a truly serious threat to that relationship. Of course, as we all know, fidelity was not Elvis's strong suit. Ann-Margret was far from the only relationship that Elvis had during his time with Priscilla, but I think she did present something of a crisis for him. Those who are close to him say that he did confide in them, that he had fallen in love with Anne and really felt torn between she and Priscilla. And when we listen to these accounts, the kind of common thread as to why the relationship ended with Anne seems to really have to do with the fact that Elvis just didn't see it working with a fellow performer. It wasn't his desire to have a serious long-term relationship with somebody else who had a career, particularly somebody who had a career as hot as Ann-Margret's was at that time. I think Elvis really saw being with him as sort of a full-time job all in and of itself, and those factors kind of put Ann-Margret out of the running. It is also said that Elvis did express that although he couldn't really see himself with somebody with a career like Ann-Margret's, he did respect Ann-Margret and her career far too much to ask her or expect her to give it up. There's also a theory that comes up a lot. I was just reading this. Maybe Ann-Margret really represented the only time that Elvis met somebody who was truly his match, who was truly his equal, who had this kind of strong, independent, fiery personality, and that there was something about this that was both very intriguing to him, very challenging to him, brought out new sides in him. But on the other hand, there might have been something that he just wasn't quite ready for, so he backed away from it. I think that's an intriguing idea. I do think that there may be some shades of truth to that. But it's interesting to hear Ann-Margret's take on where she was in her life at this point. Usually around this point in the story, Ann-Margret kind of trails off and makes a few cameo appearances, but we don't really hear a whole lot about the specifics of what happened to her after she left Elvis's story. One thing I do want to kind of backtrack and add before we really get into that, the famous canon story that everybody's probably heard is that the thing that really kind of broke down the relationship with Elvis was that Ann was quoted in a fan magazine article as having said that she and Elvis were seriously involved and engaged to be married. Now, supposedly this really enraged Elvis. He was very angry about having his privacy violated, and he was suspicious that this might have been her using him in their relationship in some way for publicity. That is what we hear sometimes. We certainly hear this backed up by Priscilla's accounts in Elvis and Me, where she describes being with Elvis when the story broke and him becoming very angry, saying he couldn't believe that she had done this to him. And, well, it's entirely possible that he had this reaction. I do wonder when I read this sometimes how much of this was his genuine gut reaction to this event, and how much of it might have been a little bit of an attempt to do some damage control to the situation. Obviously, he knew Priscilla was going to be furious when she read this. Priscilla was already very paranoid about Ann-Margret, and so I almost wonder if this wasn't a little bit of an attempt to kind of detract from his betrayal in the situation by putting the focus more on Ann-Margret's betrayal of him. Of course, we can't really know for sure. We don't even really know exactly what happened in this interaction between the two of them, but I do wonder about this because in Ann's autobiography, when she describes this incident, that she had never said that they were engaged, she was misquoted. And so she was quite upset by what Elvis might think about this, and so she called him to apologize. She said his reaction to her on the phone was very casual. He basically told her, "Hey, I know how the fan magazines are. It was only a matter of time before something like this happened. Don't worry about it." Now again, that's Ann's account. It may or may not be true. We don't really have any way to fact check it. It's totally possible that perhaps Elvis was trying to be gracious to Ann. It could be that maybe she's simplifying the story just to sort of make the point that there were no long-term hard feelings about it. We don't really know. But I am inclined to think that this wasn't the absolute breaking point for them. And the reason that I say that is because that article ran in early November of 1963. And we do know that at the time of the JFK assassination in late November of 1963, Ann-Margret was still in the picture. This was slightly after this article had ran, but it is backed up by both Ann and the Memphis Mafia in accounts that they've told about the day that Kennedy was shot, that Ann was present with Elvis when this happened. They stayed up all night watching the coverage on the news and comforting each other. They were both very shaken by this. And so we do know that she was around for at least a little bit after the magazine article ran. Another thing, speaking of magazine articles, that's kind of interesting is going back and looking at some other things that appeared in fan magazines at this time. Ann may have been using the fan magazines and the press to send some coded messages to Elvis about how she felt about this. And by this I mean that shortly after that initial article ran, Ann gave another interview with Sheila Graham. Sheila asked her about the rumor of she and Elvis being engaged. And Ann gave a very direct answer to this. She first of all said, "No, I never said that. I was a victim of circumstance. I was misquoted." But she goes on to say, however, I'm very interested in getting married. I believe that the man should be the boss in a relationship, and if a man wanted me to stop working in order to be his wife, I would absolutely do that. Which is just interesting because, you know, if we kind of look at this as Elvis being primarily torn between Priscilla and Ann-Margret at this time in terms of who might make the better marriage material. Speculation here is that the ways in which Priscilla might have had a leg up here had to do with the idea that Elvis might have seen her at this time as somebody who was more likely to be a submissive, a more traditional submissive stay-at-home wife. He may have misjudged that a little bit, but you know for a fact that Ann-Margret was not that. And so it's interesting to think that reading between the lines of this may have been a little message that she was trying to send to Elvis. Furthermore, there was a final article beyond this where this one reporter got a hold of Priscilla, her mother, Ann-Margret, and Elvis. With Priscilla and her mother, she was trying to find out if Elvis and Priscilla had secretly gotten married. They both gave very coy answers. She couldn't really get anywhere with them. She did an interview with Ann-Margret where Ann actually showed her the gorgeous round pink bed that Elvis had commissioned for her, shared that Elvis had this specially made for her. And finally, the same reporter visited Elvis on the set of one of his films and started asking him about Ann-Margret. He kind of denied any kind of romance. He just said, hey, she's great. There's no involvement between us. That story about us being engaged wasn't true. And then the reporter kind of sprung on him, well, that's interesting that you're not in a relationship with her. Why did you have this bed commissioned for her? And the way that she kind of described Elvis's response was a little bit comical. He was sort of playing dumb and, you know, just, he looked really shocked that she brought this up, and he was kind of flustered and fumbling and kind of trying to play dumb to get off the hook and just sort of saying things like, a bed? Well, that's the craziest thing I ever heard. Well, I'll be damned. A bed. She eventually let him off the hook, but not without noting how awkward and uncomfortable he seemed answering these questions. Shortly after this, in 1964, Ann met the actor Roger Smith. Roger Smith was most known for his role in the iconic television series 77 Sunset Strip. This was a show that really kind of captured the zeitgeist of the times. He played kind of a hip, swinging detective in Hollywood, private detective in Hollywood. It's a really fun show. When Ann and Roger first met, Roger was 9 years Ann's senior. He was separated from his first wife, with whom he had 3 children, and he was kind of at a crossroads point in his acting career. Roger was at a point where he was becoming a little bit less interested in being in front of the camera and a little bit more interested in other aspects of the business. He had aspirations to write screenplays, to produce, to manage talent. And they kind of met at an interesting point in both their lives. Not only was Roger at a little bit of a crossroads for where he wanted to take his career next, but Ann was at a point where, in a very short period of time, after having had a very promising start in Hollywood, her career and her finances were really on the verge of going belly up. As it turned out, she was to find out that her business manager had made a series of really unscrupulous and in some cases possibly even fraudulent financial decisions behind her back, which had left her hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. And she was beginning to have some frustrations with how her agents had managed her film career. After such a big start in Hollywood, Ann was really having a difficult time finding film roles by this point. A lot of this had to do with the fact that although Ann-Margret had generated such interest when she first exploded upon the scene, Hollywood really didn't know what to do with her. She was often cast in roles exploiting her sex kitten image. Some of the titles of these films make their intent pretty clear. Kitten with a Whip, The Swinger, which may be one of the worst movies of the 60s. And although these movies were kind of meant to sort of play up on Ann's sexy image and be sort of fun and light, their movies were beginning to flop. It was becoming harder for her to find work. Ann also began to realize that the fact that her agents and her managers had hyped her up so much at the beginning of her career to try to draw attention toward her, it had actually created a situation where there was some resentment toward her in the industry, which was compounded by the fact that as her movies were starting to flop, there was just kind of a belief in Hollywood that maybe she hadn't delivered on the early hype. I think also at this point there was a tendency for people to not take Ann very seriously as an actress. She was really kind of identified with kind of sex kitten roles and not necessarily serious dramatic work. This was a time when filmmaking and Hollywood were changing. Audiences' tastes were changing. Another thing about this era was that, and I think this affected both Elvis and Ann-Margret, was that because a film like Viva Las Vegas was very much designed to feature singing and dancing, as the 60s wore on, this really wasn't the golden age of Hollywood musicals. And because these were the types of movies that Ann was originally kind of pushed into, they began to fall out of favor. She just had a more difficult time finding work. According to Ann, she knew by the time of her third date with Roger that he was the man she was going to marry. She immediately felt a sense of trust toward him, a sense of security with him, and she said that she just instinctively knew that he was the right person for her. But it wasn't exactly all smooth sailing for them either in the beginning. Just as Ann had possibly created something of an emotional crisis for Elvis earlier, Roger created something of an emotional crisis for Ann. At this point, Ann still had her own demons that she had to face. I think Roger was somebody who really had the emotional maturity and the belief in her potential to help her do this, but it took her having to be willing to take risks and go out of her comfort zone at this time. At this point, Ann was still very heavily dependent on her parents emotionally. She still struggled with the idea of letting anybody else in or getting really serious with anybody because of the attachment she had to her parents. And this really created a conflict for her and Roger early on. In fact, after she and Roger married, on their wedding night, Ann left Roger and went back to her parents because she fell into a state of crisis over the wedding. And it took her some time to work out where this sense of panic was coming from and why she was having this knee-jerk pulling back from Roger reaction. The conclusion that she came to, working through this with both her parents and Roger, was that because of the emotional dependency she had on her parents, she felt like she was betraying them by getting married. It was very difficult for her to leave that part of her young life behind and mature into the idea of being married. However, with Roger's support, she was able to do this, and they quickly reunited. Another issue between the two of them was that Roger was very bothered by what he saw as exploitation of Ann by her handlers at this point. Roger felt very strongly that Ann was far too talented and had far too much potential to be in a point where her career was in such bad shape, and he was also very frustrated by what her manager had done with her financial situation. Because Roger had his own interest in this point in kind of going into more of the business end of the industry, he really had a lot of ideas of things that he believed he could do to help Ann. He wanted her to get rid of her agent and her managers, and so that the two of them could collaborate on her career and he could take over the management of her career. But this was a really hard thing for Ann to consent to at the time. Although she was devastated to learn what her manager had done with her finances behind her back and frustrated with the job that her agents had done, she was instilled with a very deep sense of loyalty to these people because she felt like when she was a young unknown, these were the people that had taken her under their wing, built her a career, and she really felt like she owed them everything. It was hard for her to stand up to people. It was hard for her to stand up for herself. It was hard for her to say no. She still had this natural tendency to be a people pleaser, so she didn't quite know how to break these relationships and continued to allow herself to be taken advantage of for several years after her marriage to Roger. Things did get to the point where she felt frustrated enough to make the break from them. And at that time, Roger did begin managing her, but it was a difficult thing for her to do. Another aspect that Roger helped her with was to help her overcome her drinking. Ann had, through the years, developed a dependency on alcohol, and this was something that Roger confronted her on, supported her with overcoming, and with him by her side, she was able to get sober. When Roger began managing Ann's career, he became very single-handedly devoted to it, and he had some very specific ideas about how to revive her career. One thing Roger really focused on was the idea that she had a lot of versatility in her talent. His idea was to try to find things for her to do that would take advantage of all of her talents. He really saw her particular brand of showmanship as a natural fit for Las Vegas and immediately set up to work developing a show where she could become a headliner in Vegas. This was an enormously successful leg of Ann's career. She continued to be a powerhouse stage performer in Vegas throughout the 1970s and was even at one point dubbed the Queen of Vegas due to her success in this arena. Roger additionally arranged for Ann to star in a number of very successful television specials, as well as becoming a very beloved and popular USO performer entertaining the troops in Vietnam. In addition to this, Roger also set his focus on Ann's film career. He was interested in reviving her film career, helping her get quality parts, helping people take her seriously as an actress. And he was able to really pull off some pretty impressive feats for her there. In fact, in the 1970s, Ann worked very steadily in films, became a respected actress, and garnered 2 Oscar nominations. One for 1972's Carnal Knowledge opposite Jack Nicholson, and again for her work in the film version of The Who's rock opera Tommy. And really, at the time, these were both performances that were really outside of the box from what people expected from Ann-Margret. Her work in Carnal Knowledge was a very gritty, raw performance, and it really, really blew people away. Additionally, her work in Tommy was outside of the box for her, and she was rewarded for taking this risk with another Oscar nomination. It was really the work that she did in the 70s under Roger's care where her career really began to thrive and really helped cement her legend. As Ann rounded out the 70s, Roger and Ann were faced with more complications in their relationship due to Roger's medical issues. Roger had previously suffered a blood clot while he was working on 77 Sunset Strip, which he recovered from, and shortly after that he had been diagnosed with a neuromuscular condition. In the early 80s, Roger's health problems really began to affect him more, and as a result, throughout the 80s and 90s, he at times had to take a step back to focus on his health. Ann, in turn, also slowed down from her career a bit to be able to help care for Roger. Later down the road, Roger was additionally diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, and Ann continued to help care for him and support him until his death in 2017. Roger died roughly a month after celebrating his 50th wedding anniversary with Ann. And when we're looking at Ann-Margret and where she fits into Elvis's story and timeline, we don't often really hear much about her life after Elvis, but doing a deep dive into this and really learning more about her relationship with Roger Smith, perhaps maybe Ann-Margret did end up, after all, with the man she was supposed to be with. I really feel like Ann needed somebody who could provide her with the trust and security that Roger was able to in order to face her demons at the time and grow. And Roger sacrificed his own career to be able to support Ann's. In regards to his decision to retire from acting to focus on helping Ann's career, Roger later said that once he met Ann-Margret, being with her was more important to him than his childhood dreams of being a famous actor, and it was easy for him to leave that behind. Another reason he cited for this decision was that it was just too hard on the two of them when they had to be apart from each other, taking separate acting roles. And when I think about this, Roger making these kinds of sacrifices for Ann, Roger giving up his career to manage Ann's, the support and the strength that he was able to give her to overcome her issues with substance abuse. I think Roger had an emotional maturity that allowed Ann to feel safe and protected in a way that helped her grow. And as special and as intense as I think that the love affair between Elvis and Ann-Margret truly was, it's hard to imagine those things having happened with Elvis. That wouldn't have necessarily translated into fidelity. I think when we look at Elvis and his relationships with women, I would really describe him as having been loyal, if not faithful. I think that maybe during the time of their romance when they were dating, Ann-Margret was probably a savvy and cool enough customer to not demand fidelity from him or nag him about being only with her, knowing that that would probably only alienate him. And also probably knowing at this time that her rival for his affection, Priscilla, was very much nagging him about being faithful. Plus, she was Ann-Margret, the premier sex symbol of her time. I don't think she was going to grovel for anybody's attention because she knew she didn't have to. But just because she might have been willing to accept that in a dating relationship doesn't necessarily mean that that would have translated into accepting it in marriage. One of the real hallmarks when we look at the marriage between Ann and Roger was the commitment, the trust, the fact that they became inseparable. I think that that kind of security and commitment was very important to Ann. Ann-Margret today is 82 years old. She's just as feisty as she was back in the 60s. She continues to ride motorcycles. She released an album of 60s music last year. She remains active. She's every bit the legend and the icon she always was, and she remains a national treasure. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Have a great day. I'll see you next time. Take care.
He's not so much.